Hello and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you right there, everyone who's watching this. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. And today on the show, I've got Dr. Josh Rasmussen, who's been on so many times at this point. He's our resident philosopher. He's a Christian philosopher out at Azusa Pacific University. He's got a PhD in
philosophy.
Just philosophy. That was one thing that I had to learn because I'm not an academic. Yeah. Well, what was your dissertation in? I feel like I've already asked you this, but just remind us.
Well, it was actually on the correspondence theory of truth, so metaphysics. So
and you wrote a book on it, yeah?
Specialization in the foundation of existence or the nature of things. Yeah. Yeah.
Well. Okay. Let's get back on track here. So we're talking about a modal argument from contingency. Is that the right way to say it? Okay.
Yeah.
So
or modal cosmological argument, broadly speaking. Sure.
When people hear the term modal, they probably have no idea what that means. But modal, all that means is possibility. It's logic of possibility and necessity. So an argument like this, a cosmological argument, a modal cosmological argument, is about possibility. So it introduces this. So here's a modal argument that you might be familiar with already, is the ontological argument, which basically says if it's possible that God exists, then God exists. And the second premise in some formulations of the argument is it's possible that God exists, and the conclusion follows God exists. So what's unique about this argument, it's very, very special because cosmological arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument from the beginning of the universe, or like a standard contingency argument, why is there something rather than nothing? These arguments don't necessarily focus on possibility so much. And so, but what you have here, Josh, is an argument that it doesn't even exist in the literature yet. You were just telling me that before we went live. This
form of it, yeah.
This form of it doesn't exist in the literature yet. So what you're about to hear and listen to is something that it's so fresh. This is like cutting edge philosophy. Can't get this anywhere else. Anyway, okay, so let's take about 60 seconds.
To prepare something special for you, Cameron, and for your audience, something that no one else on the earth has seen. And of course, given that it's fresh, this particular form is fresh, that also makes it kind of vulnerable to problems that are unforeseen. So I'm going to stick my neck out there and set it on that note.
On that note, as you are listening to this interview, then if you have a question, if you have an objection that pops up in your mind, we're going to get to those. So once he lays out, he's going to he has something prepared to basically lay out what the argument is, and then toward the end of this interview, I don't know how long that section is going to take, but at the end of that, we're going to do some Q&A. If you have an objection, you have a question, then jot it down. Don't put it in the live chat yet. Actually, write that. I'll let you know when to send it. If you send it, hey, I'll mention this. If you send it as a super chat, I'll be able to go back through the live chat and find that really easily. So if you have a question, burning question, you don't want to lose it, then send it as a super chat, and we can get to that later. All right. With that out of the way, let's get into it. So take about 30, 60 seconds, fill out any more of the details that I didn't give them about who you are, what you do, what you focus on, and everything.
Sure.
And then
so I'm a philosopher. I'm interested in understanding the foundations of things, foundations of mind, foundations of existence. And I always like to add that I'm married to the objectively most beautiful woman on earth. I don't know how I got lucky like that. Her name is Rachel. And various things like that describe me. But yeah, I teach at Azusa Pacific University. And I'm passionate to understand what's true. It's kind of my driving interest.
How many books do you have?
Yeah.
How many books have you published so far? Is it 3 or 4?
Well, so it kind of depends on how you count. I have several academic books and then a few more popular level books. A couple co-authors with my wife. And so on my academic CV, I don't usually count the ones that are maybe more popular level. So I haven't really added them up, but 5 or 6 or so, somewhere in there.
And you've also got some articles that you've written, and the ones that are relevant to what we're talking about today. You've got some on the contingency argument from states of affairs to a necessary being, from a necessary being to a perfect being, and you've written your book, your Unnecessary Existence, with Alexander Proust. So you've done a lot of research in this area.
On this. I have a website, necessarybeing.com. People can go there to explore this topic. Yeah, this has been a driving interest. Yeah.
And how have we not mentioned that you also have a YouTube channel where you make videos and you basically explain some of these arguments in visual form, and you have a really cool thing that you do where it's I don't know. I don't know how you do it with all the hands moving around and drawing stuff and everything. It's really great. It's really great. And the link to his YouTube channel is in the description of this video. So just do a little drop down. Oh, and actually while you're there, subscribe to our channel too. Subscribe to his channel. Subscribe to our channel, and go check out his stuff if you want to. If you're getting something out of it, that's actually something that's important to point out. Is that don't subscribe to just every YouTube channel, because if you subscribe to a YouTube channel and you end up watching none of their videos, that actually hurts them in the long run. So only subscribe to my channel and his channel if you're really interested in this stuff, if you're really interested in what we're doing. All right, let's enough banter. Let's get to the argument. How do we start this? Yeah. Where
I was thinking it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the value or the purpose of the argument. And so I have just a couple preliminary points. So the first thing I really want to say is that I think of this argument the way that I think of any argument, which is a potential weight of a reason that could be on the scale in your own mind. It's a potential weight of a reason. I think this is very helpful because for any question that you ask, you can add up weights on both sides of a scale for or against a position. And I think sometimes people will think it's sort of all or nothing. You could, at the end of this conversation, come away thinking that the argument we've just discussed provides some weight of some reason for a conclusion that you may actually still, at the end, disagree with. And that's okay. And I think it's helpful to sort of think of it as a weight. And then also related that I want to sort of invite you, as you're considering the argument, to kind of think about the premises by your own light and by your own experience. And I think sometimes people will think of arguments as almost like this sort of objective bar that's either successful or unsuccessful. But I find that it's actually much more empowering to think of arguments as potential servants for your own thinking, because everybody will come to the argument with a different set of experiences, a different set of concepts of interpretation. And so I want to just sort of encourage you to sort of think about it from your own perspective and consider whether it might be useful for you in your thinking of sort of the ultimate questions. Okay, so I was telling you, Cameron. Yeah.
Let me stop. Let me pause you right there. She said arguments are servants. Tell me more about that. How does that work?
I feel like, Cameron, I keep thinking about this. I feel like anything that,
because it almost sounds. So here's something that kind of popped up in my mind as like a potential. So if an argument is just to serve you, it kind of seems like we can just go whatever direction that we want. In essence, we're not being guided by the truth. We're just being guided by what we want.
The worry is that you sort of rationalize your prior. You sort of serve yourself. I was thinking of it as serving other people. And I was thinking of this in terms of sort of the way that I see creations being used. Sometimes they're used to control people, enslave minds. Sometimes they're used to liberate and serve and empower people. And what I'm trying to say is, like, I really want this discussion to serve your audience no matter where they're coming from. And if at the end they disagree with the conclusion, I want them to still feel encouraged and served, and they're given something interesting to think about. And so that's how I'm thinking of it here.
And you're definitely not thinking just believe whatever you want to believe and don't care about truth. That's not what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not trying to like rationalize my view. Like, this argument, I'm going to defend it because after all, it supports my prior belief. So it's actually interesting. This leads into the story I wanted to share. And this is about the value of the argument. When I was early in graduate school, I was thinking a lot about these arguments from explanation. And I was actually had a conversation with another graduate student about an argument, kind of a familiar argument from contingency, arguing from finite contingent things to sort of an explanation of those things.
Did you say that you were in graduate school at the time?
Yeah, we were both kind of early in graduate school. And we were just having a conversation. And at this point, I had already kind of thought through some of these different lines, these alternative lines that go through possible explanation, which we'll get into. But I wanted to just sort of out of curiosity test this other graduate student's mind and see what they think about a kind of traditional argument from explanation. And so I remember I asked him, like, so what do you think about this idea that, things generally have an explanation? So if you look at stones and buildings and all these things, those things don't just generally pop into being from nothing without any cause at all. Like, there's usually some prior factors that explain them. And he seemed fine with that. And then I said, well, what do you think about the idea that we can use this principle of explanation and apply it to just all of contingent reality, and then infer that there's going to be some explanation of all of contingent reality? And no, he's a graduate student, so he's thought of this. Isn't new to him, right? So his quick response was, well, why think that this totality of contingent things has an explanation? Maybe it's just brute, And we could sort of add, if you think that God exists and God is brute without any deeper outside explanation that produced God, then why can't sort of the naturalist or somebody who doesn't believe in God think the same thing about the universe? I mean, everybody has to have sort of an ultimate stopping point of explanation, and so he was presenting this as an ultimate stopping point. Just the contingent things are brute. Now, of course, we were in graduate school, so it's not like I hadn't thought about that before either. And so instead of actually defending this principle of explanation, I wanted to kind of test out another idea that I had been thinking about, which is the sort of modal argument from possibility. And so I said to him, well, if it's possible that there's no explanation of contingent things, do you think it would be at least similarly possible that there is an explanation of contingent things? And he thought about that, and he said, yeah, actually, that did seem plausible to him. And then I was kind of grinning on the inside because I knew where the argument leads after that. I was going to lead to something that was going to challenge his belief. And so I was very curious to see what he would think about that. So I'm not going to get ahead and spell out that argument here because we're going to do that more carefully in a moment. But just to share the story, I did spell out the argument. And then his response was, especially because we weren't in a battle mode, so it wasn't like I'm grinning in the inside because I'm about to conquer him. It was more just a conversation. And so when I spelled out the rest of the argument, he said that he thought it was very interesting and it was something he wanted to think more about. And by the way, I had the same conversation repeated later in graduate school, or maybe this was the first year out of graduate school. And I was talking with a philosopher named Evan Fales. Some people in your audience may know the name. Do you know Evan Fales?
I've heard of his name.
From University of Iowa.
Is he the Molinist guy?
He's not. He's an atheist philosopher who's kind of known for sort of articulating stuff in the philosophy of science, and he's got some good work in epistemology, and he also does some things in philosophy of religion. And he's a senior level philosopher. He might even be retired or close to retired at this point. But I had the same conversation with him, and the outcome of the conversation was exactly the same. In fact, I asked him what he thought of a possible explanation, and he thought that was plausible. And then I spelled out the rest of the argument, and he said that was very interesting. He said he would like to think more about it, and he did think more about it. And so the reason why I'm sharing these stories is just because sometimes one line can sort of lead to a certain roadblock, but then another line can kind of go around that roadblock in a helpful way. And the thing that's new here, because we just said that the argument we're going to give here is new, is that those arguments, I was trying those out as pathways to a necessary thing or necessary part of reality. Whereas we've sort of raised the bar, or I guess I have, and I want to give an argument for a maximally great reality, supreme being, using the same type of argument.
So I think it'd be important at this point to define some terms. There was only 3 that I caught that I think might be helpful to define. So contingent is one of them, brute is another, and then you use the term naturalist. And I think that it's helpful to define that term because if you're just coming to this conversation, you may not know how that term is being used in philosophy. Anyways, let's get through this story. Give me your definition of contingent, brute, and then what a naturalist is.
Okay, so contingent is something that exists but could possibly not exist or could fail to exist. So an example might be like my hand, trying to get my hand in view here.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's backwards from what you think. My hand could be destroyed. If it were destroyed, it would cease to be in some sense. Maybe its particles would still exist, but that particular arrangement wouldn't continue to be. And so that would count as a contingent thing. A brute thing would just be something without any further explanation. And then a natural thing, that's a tough one for me because people define that in different ways. But roughly, you could sort of think of it as it's not God. So, it's difficult because at the end of one of my books, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? I end up defining what I called supreme naturalism, which was God and natural. And so there's a definition of natural that some people use that actually is not incompatible with theism. So I think it's actually kind of worth mentioning that. But for our purposes here, we can just say not God.
That's one of the reasons why I really dislike the natural supernatural distinction.
Me too.
Is that it's just really difficult to define. And when you say it, you're kind of like, oh yeah, I know what that means. But then when you start to really get down and try to define what natural means, what supernatural means, to me it's like supernatural is just all the silly stuff that we don't believe in anymore, and natural is all the stuff that we believe in now.
Yeah, all the stuff that we know exists, right?
Yeah,
that science reveals and uncovers. Yeah, I'm actually part of a naturalist Facebook group. And some people were kind of defining naturalism in a very broad way as just anything that exists. Or at least being equivalent with whatever exists. So that by definition, there's a sense in which the supernatural doesn't exist. And I think some people do almost talk this way, like God is outside of reality and God produced reality. Well, okay, then is God not real? You know what I mean? So I think it is helpful to use other terms.
Yeah, well, let's get back to contingent and brute. So I think that those terms are relatively straightforward. Brute, on the other hand, when we say like something is brute, we just mean that it would exist. In this, I guess I'm thinking hypothetically for the sake of argument, something would exist brutally or would be brute if it just exists, has no explanation. There's no reason why it's there.
Yeah,
like
for example, my hand, the pixels of my hand right here, they're just there. They came into view uncaused. It's not like I put my hand here or anything. That's just, those pixels are an anomaly that just appeared from nothing, uncaused. That would be an example of something that's brute.
Yeah, and some people, I think, confuse necessary things with brute things. But true. A necessary thing, something that is not contingent, something that has to exist, can still have an explanation.
In principle, you could think, Graham Oppy, for example, argues that necessary things are explained by their necessity. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, so some people conflate that, but anyways, it may come out later on in the discussion, maybe even some objections that we get later on and work through. So, okay, where should we go from here? You said you wanted to spell out the argument in more detail.
So I'll do that, and I hope you're not upset at me for just doing one more preliminary thing, which kind of has to do with using arguments to serve people. I mean, I just really care a lot about this. So I've had two other conversations with an argument kind of like this. One where I was talking with somebody who accepted every premise, and then at the end of the argument, they saw that the conclusion followed from the premises, and she looked at me, this was back in graduate school, and she said that it was frustrating to her. I said, well, why is it frustrating? She said, because I know there's something wrong with this argument because the conclusion is false, but I can't see what it is. And she was kind of feeling maybe a little bit trapped by the argument. And then we got a little more personal, and we got talking about some deeper things and that were more personal. And in that conversation, it kind of helped me to realize just the value of giving people sort of kind of space to sort of think. And it might be that, other people on further reflection, they have good reason to think that the argument is misleading. Okay. And so I want to affirm that. And then the other story is that there was an example where I gave a version of this argument and I included a way out. Not exactly this argument, but it was similar style. It was a modal cosmological argument. And I gave a way out. And then somebody encountered that argument on their own, and it actually led them. It was part of them coming to believe in God, and they talked about this on their blog, even though I had a way out in the argument. And there was something, I just always think about that, and I think there's something valuable about kind of giving people sort of freedom to kind of think things through. And it doesn't even mean that they'll necessarily see it your way in the end, but it's just a way of respecting people and kind of giving them that space to process the ideas from their perspective. Because, what happens, I think sometimes you try to daydream, like, what would happen if the argument was so strong that the person who didn't want to think the conclusion was true was trapped? Like, they had to admit it. It's like, well, I've had that conversation, multiple ones. I had another one where somebody honestly said that if I were to be rational, I would have to believe the conclusion. But I have some personal reasons why I don't want to believe the conclusion. That actually happened. In another conversation. And I don't want to suggest that it's always for personal reasons, or I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is just that I can really see how the arguments can serve people the most when people feel the sort of freedom to sort of think it through and see if it makes sense to them. And if it does, then it'll serve you. And if it doesn't, that's fine. It doesn't have to force you to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's important. It kind of strikes me as like the normal way that people are persuaded is through this process of like slow it down, and like you hear one thing on some day, and maybe that day that you hear it first, you're like, that's ridiculous, and that's so dumb. And then after a couple of days, you think about it a little bit more, and you're like, maybe there's something there to that. And
Yes.
so I don't know. And then,
Cameron,
a couple of days later,
I've changed my mind on that. It took me 10 years. In fact, I was starting to write a story this morning of some particular thing I changed my mind on that I want to share, and I won't share it here, but it took 10 years, and it was just like you said, Cameron. It was like in the beginning, it's like, no, that's definitely not true. And I don't really trust even these sources. And then you see something from another angle, and then all of a sudden I'm starting to think about it in a new way, and everything changes. And so that can definitely happen for sure.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to realize that, think about that. Okay. All right. Now we can get into the argument. Okay. So I wrote it down because, like I said, this is a new thing. This is a new invention, new creation just for you guys. It is based on other stuff, so it will sound familiar to some of you who know my work. But let me just give you the premises, and then Cameron, you can kind of help me unpack these as we want to do. So the first premise is it's going to be the explanatory principle. It's kind of the engine for the argument. So this premise, and let me just get very clear, this is motivated by someone who says, well, maybe there's no explanation of contingent, limited, finite things. And so they would say that's possible. And then I want to say, okay, well, if that's possible, if it's at least logically possible, then is it equally logically possible that there is an explanation? Okay, so that's kind of the idea. So I call this the principle of possible explanation, and then more precisely,
it kind of sounds like a parity argument.
Kind of, yeah. It's sort of a symmetry, yeah.
It's like if you think you have reason to think that there's no explanation, then seems equally possible that there is an explanation.
Yes, and by the way, this is exactly what motivates the reverse ontological argument. Mm-hmm. And what gave rise to our talking about this today was when I was talking with Alex O'Connor, cosmic skeptic, about the ontological argument, and he very insightfully and well articulated this, the reverse ontological argument, that if God's existence is possible, well then God's non-existence might be equally possible. It might seem equally possible to you. And so that kind of, the problem there is that if God does exist, then only one of those possibilities is actually possible. Mm-hmm. So you can't have both. But the beautiful thing, and I'll say this right here, the beautiful thing about this argument I'm going to give you is that you can have both the possibility of an explanation and the possibility of no explanation. And some of your viewers may be sort of anticipating this as a possible objection that, well, this is the same problem. You can only have one of the possibilities. But no, in this case, you can have them both. So I'm just playing along with them, saying, okay, well, if it's possible for there to be no explanation, is it also possible for there to be what we already are seeing in ordinary experience, which is a further explanation of limited contingent things? So here's the principle, okay? And I'll just lay out all the premises, and then I can support them. So the first premise is that the universe can have an explanation. And now here I want to just define universe as the totality of things that are not God, okay? And by God, I'm going to just say a maximally great something. So it's going to be limited, contingent, finite things that aren't maximal. So that's just what I mean by universe. And so kind of stick with me with that definition. If there's another word we could use, maybe Cameron, you give me another word, sort of the blob
imperfect.
Of the imperfect or the limited. So I'm going to say it can have an explanation. And the word can there, and this is kind of the new part, is it's not just a metaphysical can, it's a logical can. And by logical can, I mean it's consistent with the truths of reason, whatever they are. So it's consistent with truths of logic, truths of mathematics, anything that you can sort of see by the light of reason in your mind to be true, like 2 + 2 = 4. Or if there were 4 people on a bus, then there were more than 3 people on that bus. And how do you know that? Well, you don't have to actually look at buses to figure that out because it's an if-then, but you can just sort of see that by the light of reason in your mind. And so these principles, which I'll say constitute the principles of reason. And so when I say can, I just mean there's no way to deduce a contradiction from reason if you deny it. So it's consistent with reason. So I'm just saying that limited contingent things consistent with reason could have an explanation. And then premise 2, the universe cannot, consistent with reason, be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. And I wanted just to say that I'm using the term explanation to mean a non-circular or external explanation. And I'll leave open whether you could also have internal explanations that's consistent with this argument, just that it's also consistent to have external explanations. And so if an explanation is external, then an external explanation of the non-maximally great things is not going to be solely in terms of non-maximally great things. So that will be a circle. So therefore, the universe can be explained in terms of something that's maximally great, which we can call God. Therefore, God can exist. And that's a very significant result. Therefore, God can exist. Okay? Because this was the possibility premise in the ontological argument. And what isn't controversial among philosophers is that if, given the definitions of terms, this maximally great being can exist, then given the modal logic in play, which I think is actually part of the definition, the logic of possibility and necessity, which is part of what I mean here by possibility, we can then deduce that God actually exists. So premise 5 is God can't exist unless God exists in all possible worlds. And what I've done here is I've made a formal deduction that I'm not going to go through here. I think listeners kind of have to check this carefully because it's not an easy deduction. But I have on my website, joshualrasmussen.com/S5, okay, /S5. And there I give the deduction from God can exist to God does exist using standard logic. And so then from all this, it follows that God exists in all possible worlds, including ours. So therefore, God actually exists. Okay, so what? Yes.
What I'm working on right now is I'm actually working on putting this on the screen. So if you want to explain another part of the argument, that's good, and then I'll just continue to work on this.
Okay, yeah. So that's the outline for the argument. I think it's helpful to think of arguments as outlines, invitations to further exploration. I've seen many arguments put forward where, I don't see the premises are true. It doesn't mean the argument, therefore, is unsound. It might be sound. And so what I want to do is just kind of motivate that first premise, which, given the way that I've defined terms, I'm actually seeing everything else as following deductively by strict logical deductions. Especially if we add that the logic of possibility is part of the definition of what I mean by possibility in here, then everything just follows by standard strict deductions. So everything hinges on that first premise, which was that imperfect or limited contingent things that are non-maximal can, consistent with reason, have an explanation. And so I just have a few different motivations for the premise. So the first motivation is that this premise makes sense of our interest in explanation seeking in science. So explanation seeking has a good track record. Things generally can be further explained. And if there's an exception, and I do want to kind of present this modestly, like maybe there could be an exception, okay? But my thought is that other things being equal, you've got reason to think or to expect an explanation, or at least the logical possibility of an explanation. And so if there is an exception, we need some explanation of the impossibility of an explanation. And so that kind of leaves, that does open the door. If somebody has an explanation, this would be sort of a challenge for the viewers. Can you come up with a good explanation? And maybe you can, of why there couldn't be an explanation of the universe, understood as limited, non-maximal things. Can you think of that? And maybe you can. I mean, one explanation would be, so I was talking with Graham Oppy about this, and I mean, he has independent reasons to think that there is no maximally great being, and so therefore there couldn't be an explanation of contingent finite things. Okay, so that's why I started with thinking of this as a potential weight on a scale, because you might have reasons on both sides of the scale. So that's one possible reason, is just looking at our track record of explanation and then just saying, okay, this gives us motivation. All other things being equal, you can expect at least the possibility of an explanation.
All right, so I've got it. Let me put it up on the screen so that way everyone can see. Okay, so this is the argument, the modal cosmological argument. So we've been talking about premise 1. The universe can, consistent with reason, have an explanation. So, and this is the principle of possible explanation. So, and the motivation that you just gave right now is that it's just consistent with what we know. So maybe is it a kind of inductive argument?
Well, I was actually wanting to say something a little stronger, which is that, not that it's merely consistent with what we know, but that everything we know in science motivates this principle. that there is a further explanation of things. You can sort of summarize this as like explain as much as you can. I think I've heard Graham Oppy use this exact principle. You want to have as much explanatory depth as you can get away with. And so science seems to suggest that there is going to be a further explanation, at least the possibility. And so given this, I'm going to anticipate the possibility of an explanation of non-maximally great things. And I think it's actually worth just pointing out right here that what makes a maximally great being relevantly different, because you might think, well, doesn't everything have to have an explanation, even God? Well, this is where I think a maximally great being provides an interesting kind of solution to this problem of how can there be an ultimate? How can anything be unexplained? And I think, well, because if it's maximally great, then there can't be, its greatness, I think, is going to imply its independence, its ability to exist a se, or independent of all other things. So it's not going to have to depend on some prior causes that produce it or that explain its existence. And so, I mean, there are fine distinctions we can make here, but that's sort of roughly how I would think of it.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about right now is what you just said. How you said that God, your claim is that God cannot, it's not possible that he has an explanation. But to me, it seems like it's consistent with reason, and maybe atheists would have this objection too, is that it seems consistent with reason, with 2 + 2 = 4 and these other logical truths that you were talking about earlier. It seems consistent with those types of truths that God has an explanation. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's good. So I actually don't think it's consistent with reason that God has an explanation, where we understand reason to include all the truths that one could see by the light of reason, which include truths of greatness, truths about greatness. So, and I think this is a great question because it does highlight that sometimes we associate reason with a sort of limited set of maybe numbers or logic, and I did refer to those as examples. But I would want to even include that, for example, if you kill a person, you're killing somebody of value. Okay, I actually think that personhood entails value is a principle of reason, that you can actually see this by the light of reason. Maybe you could call this moral reason or something. So I'm thinking of reason broadly to include anything you can sort of see by this inner light.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, it does. Should we move on to premise 2?
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Well, actually, just very
defensive
quickly,
it.
Yeah. Just to point, I won't go into so much detail here, but just to point to a few additional types of motivations you could have for the first premise. One is a kind of categorical uniformity, where differences in mere shape, size, color, or other arbitrary finite differences don't seem to make a difference or count for a difference with respect to the conceivability or consistency of having an explanation. It seems like those differences don't seem to be relevant differences. And if that's right, this is sort of like, if I was thinking, like a good example of this would be if you looked up and you saw a flock of birds, and you imagine that maybe all those birds have some further explanation, but one of those birds, like right in the middle that you see, just actually popped into existence without any explanation and just joined the flock. It's like, probably you wouldn't think that. In fact, you wouldn't even be agnostic about that. It's not even that, out of intellectual humility, you'd say, well, that bird's unlike all the others. After all, it's at that location. No other bird is at that location. And so maybe, it doesn't have an explanation. It's like, no. The birds are sort of categorically uniform. You don't really see some reason to think that one bird is relevantly different from another, to think that just this one special bird would have no explanation. Now, let me be clear. If you did have an independent reason to think that one of the birds was special and that it existed maybe even eternally without an explanation, then that could make the difference. That could make the difference. But in the absence of this reason to think that there's a relevant difference, you have good reason to treat them uniformly. I think this is actually could be a very powerful argument. I mean, this is the kind of argument when I was in graduate school, just really thinking about this, that it kind of just clicked in my mind, and it was like, oh, yeah, like they have to uniformly have an explanation. And so if mere differences between one limited thing, one shape, one butterfly, one particle, aren't relevant differences, if I don't have independent reason to treat them as relevantly different, then by uniformity, I have good motivation to treat them all the same, all alike, have an explanation, or at least could have an explanation. So that's a second reason. You're smiling there, Cameron. What's
I'm
going on in
smiling
your
because I
mind?
like it. I like it a lot. I like that. It also reminds me of a lot of other conversations that you and I have had about cosmological arguments like this, and I'm just seeing a lot of connections between
Now you have to be
other
careful.
work and
That
this.
like, that emotional like that you're having could be stopping you from really thinking carefully, critically.
It
So
could.
just
It
just
could.
want to
No, no.
warn you.
Yeah, no, it could.
I'm
Yeah,
just
it's
playing.
reminding me of a. Yeah, I'm thinking about that argument, and the first time that I heard it, and how it was sort of difficult to wrap my mind around at first. And so in my upcoming debate with rationality rules, I use a very similar argument to this. I don't want to. Hopefully, I'm not giving too much away here, but I use a similar kind of argument where it's like looking at the difference between the caused and the uncaused. And in this case, you could be talking about something that has an explanation versus something that doesn't have an explanation. And so you want to ask, like, what is the feature of anything that is going to differentiate between whether it has a cause or an explanation and when it doesn't have a cause or explanation. Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to really feel. I use the term feel like very purposefully.
Yeah, I know what you
mean.
Yeah.
Because when you're thinking through some of these arguments, it's like if it doesn't click, you don't feel it. But once you understand, once you see like where this is going and how this works, then you can really feel it. And I think the same is true for something like the ontological argument. When you're first reading through that argument, you're like, okay, this is like, wordplay, or it's like some kind of weird logical trick. But then once you really start to understand that argument, and if you're convinced by it, then you're like, okay, now I'm starting to feel this. And so it took a while for me, and this is why it's bringing back positive memories for me, is when it took a while for me to really understand and grasp this argument. And when I did, I was like, yeah, it's a really strong argument.
Yeah. No, I mean, same for me. I remember being upstairs in a loft at Notre Dame, and I was writing a paper, and I used a metaphor of sort of empty, colorless marbles, then being colored into colored marbles. I was trying to illustrate the transition of, in this case, I was thinking about beginnings. And this is where I have this article, A New Argument for a Necessary Being. And this is an argument from the possibility of causing beginnings. And I just remember as I was like creating that drawing, it opened my mind to just this uniformity. And I thought, wait, because I was arguing for the possibility, but then I thought, like, how can I even make an exception to the actuality of an explanation of this kind of transition? And it was something about those marbles that kind of stripped away the details of the types of beginnings that kind of helped me to see something that all those details were almost like weeds that were kind of stopping my mind or fogging up my thinking. So I didn't see the sort of pristine, clear, logical connections. And it was like something just clicked, and I was like, oh my goodness, because I had been a skeptic up to that point of the kind of the actual explanation argument. And then I remember like going back to William Rowe's book and his objections and finding the page number to where I was skeptical and going in because something new had clicked. And I was like, and then I saw some new paths I never saw before. And so there's something there about, I think the meta lesson here is that there's a lot of truth to be seen. And sometimes what will happen is that you will see certain truths that could possibly block you from seeing other truths. That was what happened to me. It's like there were certain truths I was seeing, certain lines that were like keeping me from looking carefully to see this other line. And there was something about making it abstract, drawing the picture, and that it just like clicked. Yeah.
So I think it's time to move on to defending the second premise.
Yeah,
I'll put it back on the screen for everybody.
So the second premise, on the screen there, the universe cannot, that helps me too. The universe cannot, consistent with reason, be explained solely in terms of non-maximal things by definition of explanation. And maybe the use of the word universe could possibly be unfortunate here, but by universe, I just mean the non-maximal things. That's just what I mean. And so if I want a non-circular explanation, or at least the possibility of a non-circular explanation, the explanation is going to be in terms of something that isn't part of the thing being explained, what philosophers call the explanandum. We're not going to try to...
Let's talk more about that. What is it? What is a circular explanation?
Like if you saw a chicken and you wondered how it got there, and it wasn't that it popped into existence from nothing. No. It brought itself into existence from the land of imagination. It was like, I want to exist, and then just leaped into... Or if you jump off a cliff and you're like hoping Superman will save you, well, Superman wants you to be saved too. So he comes out of non-existence and saves you. So that would be, those are examples of self-explained self-caused things.
Yeah, so
Those aren't.
I think of circular explanations as just no explanation. It's like you're just saying it just exists. To me, when I think about like a chicken explaining itself, really what you're saying is that chicken just exists because you can't make yourself exist.
Yeah, and I want to sort of be fair that this term is kind of slippery. So Alex Proust, in his book Defending the Principle of Sufficient Reason, he talks about the possibility of self-explained contingent facts, where there's and there he might be using the term more in terms of intelligibility, or like you can understand or illuminate like why it performed that action sort of in terms of that very action. It's been a while since I've looked at those passages, but there might be sort of other ways of characterizing explanations. But I feel what you're saying, Cameron. I mean, if it's not the same as no explanation, it's like no better than no explanation.
Yeah.
But you know how I am. I like to be charitable and inclusive. So I want to say, even if you allow circular explanations, that's fine. That's consistent with my argument, because I only need the possibility of a non-circular explanation.
Oh, I see. Okay. Let me pull it back up on the screen here so I can see how that works. So the idea is we're looking at premise 2 here. And so the idea is that we can't explain the existence of the universe, and I'll just use that terminology just for the sake of understanding. So we can't explain the existence of the universe by just saying the universe explains the universe. That's sort of what's happening here.
Well, I need to actually think about this. So this form of the argument that I wrote here might actually require me, because I do say the universe cannot, consistent with reason, be solely explained in terms of itself. So here I am ruling it out in this version of the argument. So there is another version where all you need is the possibility of an explanation of, in fact, I could make this premise more modest. We just need the possibility of a non-circular explanation to get to the possibility of a maximally supreme thing. But you are right that you were right in your anticipation that this premise is stronger. It's stronger than it needs to be. But it's also, I mean, I think it's true. So
Yeah. So that's the idea behind it, is that so for the universe cannot be explained solely. I think that's also probably key. The universe can't be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. And so that it can at least be explained in terms of something else. Okay, yeah, there you go.
So even if it could be explained in terms of itself, there's maybe another possible world in which it's explained in terms of something external.
There you go. Okay, so let's see. So how does this conclusion follow? Therefore, the universe can be explained in terms of God. How does that fall? Because it doesn't seem very,
By the definitions, just unpacking the universe there is the non-maximally great things. And so then the maximally great thing that would explain it is what I mean by God in this case.
So it's just a matter of defining the terms, unpacking the terms. And some of this stuff can get a little bit technical, and it's like difficult to work it all out unless you like write it out.
Here's a visual that I think will help your audience. Is like, imagine different possible worlds, and then go to a possible world where the limited, contingent, finite, non-maximal things have an external explanation in terms of a supreme foundation, a maximal foundation. Okay, so this will give us a possible world in which there's a supreme foundation. I think that kind of visual of sort of thinking of different possible worlds, and then we're just finding one possible world, one world that's consistent with truths of reason in which these contingent things and non-maximal things are explained.
Here's something that just popped up in my mind. So what if something was logically possible but not metaphysically possible? So it could be like consistent with truths of reason that there's a possible world where there's an explanation of the universe, but that wouldn't be metaphysically possible. It couldn't exist in the actual world.
Yeah, that's good. I have that in my notes, because that's, I think, what makes this argument kind of different from other modal arguments, is that I'm even just leaving open questions about metaphysical possibility. So what you end up deducing is the metaphysical necessity of a supreme being, because what you end up deducing is that there is this thing that is maximally great in the actual world, and if its maximal greatness includes necessary existence, then you get its necessary existence. But none of that is built into any of the premises. You don't need to have a view about that. you could actually think that that it's just metaphysically impossible for there to be an explanation, but it's still logically possible in terms of how we define logical possibility here. And that's fine. That's all you need to get to the conclusion. In fact, then you can revisit the thought that it wasn't metaphysically possible, because the conclusion will give you a weight of a reason to rethink that.
Okay, I'm putting the argument back up on the screen. It seems like I'm looking at the live chat, and a lot of people are saying it's really helpful to have it up on the screen. I can't have it up the whole time because then it would just be really boring. This video would be super boring. So I'll put it up as often as I can. So we've gotten through premise 1. We've defended premise 1. Premise 2 has been defended as well. And then is there anything else you'd like to say in defense of 2?
No. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay,
so then the first conclusion follows, therefore the universe can be explained in terms of God. Mm-hmm. That's number 3. Number 4 is another conclusion, therefore God can exist. Yeah. And how does that follow from 3?
Yeah, just the universe can be explained in terms of God, but then it follows that there can be a God that explains the universe. There can be a maximally great being that explains the universe. And so then 4 is actually a more modest version of 3, because I'm just dropping the universe. So there can be a supreme being that explains the universe, therefore there can be a supreme being.
That's interesting. Okay, so then premise 5 is God can't exist unless God exists in all possible worlds. And this one you have defended. I mean, do we need to talk about any kind of modal logic here? Formal S5 and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so first I just want to say it's actually very helpful, Cameron, that we're going premise by premise. What I've noticed is that people tend to, the sort of temptation is to sort of think of arguments in a lump sum. And so they'll have objections to arguments as a whole, but that's often very unhelpful, because usually the work that's being, I should say usually, always the work that's being done in the argument is in the premises. And so looking at each premise one at a time is very helpful. Now, as far as the logic of 5, I think it probably is the best to just have a look at that link to get clarity on that. But what I'll say kind of more intuitively is that if you think of God as a maximally great being, that includes the maximal properties of the great properties of necessary perfection, of maximal power, maximal knowledge, perfect goodness. If you think of God in this way, and this is how I'm thinking of God, then it follows from the very definition of God that either God is impossible or God is necessary. That's kind of the idea. Is like God's the kind of being such that if God were to exist in any possible world, God would exist in all the other possible worlds. He's too great to be limited to just 1 or 2 worlds. So if he were to exist in any world, he just spans all of them automatically. That's kind of a picturesque way of kind of giving you the feel for it. But the formal deduction makes that rigorous. Yeah.
So with Richard Swinburne, he denies that. Richard Swinburne, he's a Christian philosopher, and he's done some really amazing work on God's existence. So he's some philosophers have called him like the most important natural theologian of our time, and possibly of like ever. So he's really important, and he's defended God's existence. But what makes him unique is that he thinks that God is a contingent being. He thinks that God is not necessary. Yeah. So how does your argument interact with his work?
Well, it's so interesting, Cameron, because I've had these conversations with Richard, and I think he's been developing his argument. I mean, I know he's developing his argument in light of these conversations. So one of the early conversations was one where he was saying that it was possible for there to be nothing. And so I said, okay, well, that's logically possible. And then I said, well, okay, consider the proposition that there's nothing. Does that proposition entail, what does that proposition entail? And I took him line by line. And as we went through the premises, he agreed that that proposition entailed that that proposition is true. This is the Tarski's T schema, that P, if and only if P is true. And so if that proposition is true, well, then that entails that there's something true. But wait a minute, that means that there is nothing entails that there's something, because if there's something true, there's something. So then he went back and he made some modifications, and it's kind of interesting because I've seen some revisions of his paper. I shouldn't share this. I'm going to break blind review here. But as a blind reviewer, I've seen his paper come to me. And who's the other? I won't mention this. But I can't overexpose blind review, but I gave him some comments, and I recommended revise and resubmit, and I was kind of showing him some more of these connections, and then he responded with the revision, and now I think his argument is getting to be in a better form. But getting it into a better form also makes it sort of less clearly interacting with the kind of argument I'm giving here. I guess that's maybe the simplest way to put it. So I'm not really.
So ultimately, I think
yes.
Ultimately, it sounds like you and him just have a disagreement about that. And so if you to get more into detail, we'd have to go into a whole lot more detail on what his argument is. Yeah, what his argument is and how you respond to it and how
it's a friendly disagreement. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't really interact with your work. So in order to address that objection, it sounds like we'd have to go into a whole lot more detail and probably don't have time or the space to do that here. And that would be something that would happen in like a paper instead of on a YouTube channel in a video.
Yeah, that sounds wise.
Yeah. Okay. What else do we need to know before we move to some Q&A? Because I want to get to some questions from people.
I think that's it. I think those are kind of the main things.
Okay, well, I'm sure that you're thinking. Yeah. I'm sure that you're already thinking of maybe one or two more things that you'd want to say, and even if it's related to like trying to make sure that maybe not. Yeah, talking about arguments and how they can be obstacles, and there might be something you want to say in virtue of that. But let me say this: so if you listen to this whole thing, you've been here the whole time, and you're like, okay, this argument doesn't really make sense to me, or I have a question about it, I have an objection, then let me know in the live chat right now. I'm going to pass over to Josh in just a minute to say anything else that he wants to about the argument. But I'm going to be watching the live chat from here on out as like a hawk. And so if you have a question, an objection, then let me know. We already had a few super chats come in, so we'll get to those first. But that if you have a question, then let me know. And if you want to send yours as a super chat, thank you. And it helps, and we'll definitely make sure that we get to it. Is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I'm good.
No, haven't thought of anything. Okay, all right. Well, in that case, let me scroll up and get a super chat because I know that we had at least two come in. So the first one was from, if I can find it here. Let me see. Okay, it looks like from. Let me get this interview scene off of here and then put it up on the screen from Tifer Forshen. Thank you for your super chat, by the way. He says, he or she, I always wondered, 1, if God exists in all possible worlds. 2, there's a possible world without God. 3, God does not exist. What's your response?
Okay, yeah, so there's a possible world without God. And this is a very important premise because this is precisely the premise that sort of cancels a simplified ontological argument, which starts with the premise there's a possible world in which God does exist. The idea here, and I think it's worth just kind of drawing this out again, is that either God is necessary or impossible. So you can't have that God is merely occupying some of the possible worlds without then sort of spreading his greatness out into all the possible worlds. So if God occupies any possible world, he's going to occupy all of them, all right? Which is why there's this modal argument that says, well, it's at least possible God exists in one world, and then from there you infer he exists in all the worlds. Well, you can just reverse that, which this argument does, which is nice because you can see how it's sort of symmetrical reasoning. Well, if you think it's possible that God does exist, isn't it sort of equally possible that God does not exist? And those possibilities kind of cancel sort of in the kind of epistemic force in your own mind, because how can you decide between those possibilities? And so my thought here, and I actually talk about this with Proust in our book, Necessary Existence, is that these possibilities are kind of a wash unless you have some symmetry breaker. You need some reason to prefer one possibility over another. And actually, that's where the modal cosmological argument can come in, because the modal cosmological argument is built on premises that are independently motivated. So the track record of explanation, for example, from science, or at least the possibility of an explanation, or from categorical uniformity. You know, if one bird is going to have an explanation, then all the birds, or at least could have an explanation. And those are all independent motivations for this argument that has as its conclusion that God's existence is possible, from which we deduce that there isn't a possible world actually without God. Now, on one level, this might not be 100% satisfying because you might be sort of trying to imagine a possible world that's sort of blank. And you might think, oh, I have no problem sort of imagining blankness, and there's no God there. But this is where, and I want to add this in because this is something that I think maybe a lot of people haven't heard before. Some maybe have, but this is kind of one of those more rare things, which is that I think when people are imagining a empty world, what they're doing is they're subtracting the kinds of things that could be visible. So like red balls or anything that you could see, and you have almost like this blank space. In my mind, it's like black. So then we have to remove the black as well. Okay, but I haven't thereby removed the sort of principles of reason, the laws of logic. Those aren't sort of visible in that way. And the laws of logic, I think, actually are necessary, metaphysically necessary and eternal. And I don't even think it's logically possible for them to not exist. In fact, I actually do think that the existence of nothing is self-contradictory, because the proposition that there is nothing entails that proposition is true, which entails that something is true, which entails that there's something. So I do have independent reason to think that it actually, there is no possible world without God. But that second premise is precisely the premise that the conclusion of this argument challenges.
I'm going to get back to we'll get back to the argument. I'm going to put it up on the screen in just a second. Yeah. But we have another question from Maverick Christian. He says, how do you define the light of reason?
I sort of think of it like just that intuition inside that something is true. And it's easier to kind of use examples like 2 + 2 = 4. But, my own view, and I think Maverick Christian, I think, knows me well enough to know this. My own view is that this intuition actually comes from God. So I actually think that light of reason is kind of like God's voice of conscience inside of you. And that where reason goes astray is where we, in our cooperation with that light or that intuition, misread it, or maybe we're, more certain than we should be or less certain than we should be. But that the light itself is actually coming to us sort of in the same way that conscience comes to us. That's my own view on that.
Okay, now this is a very insightful question from Brandon116. He or she says, why can't the universe be explained in terms of non-maximally great things? And he's talking about premise 2 here. So yeah. I'm gonna repeat the question, and then I'm gonna put up the argument back on the screen for everyone to see. So the question is, why can't the universe be explained in terms of non-maximally great things? And so this is a response to premise 2 of the argument, which says the universe cannot, and again, cannot is consistent with reason, be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. So he's just asking, why is this premise true?
Yeah, and I love this question because it does draw out the value of definitions, and I sort of regret using the word universe in the way that I decided to, but all that I mean here by universe is the non-maximally great things. And so the thought here is that there's going to be a kind of circularity here. I draw this out
let's define what a non-maximally great thing is. So anything in our experience, I'm just looking around at my desk. Yeah. My cup of pens is a non-maximally great thing, right? Scissors are not maximally great. Speakers are not maximally great. My computer, my printer, my lights, my camera, mountains, planets, none of those things are maximally great. And so the universe, I think you're just referring to the totality, the plurality, probably is a better term, of just everything in our experience.
Yeah, that you can see sort of like the visible things.
Right.
Somebody's probably watching this and they're thinking about maybe a more technical worry from rigid designation, and I actually do want to acknowledge that. Like there's a way of rigidly referring to a bunch of non-maximally great things, and then you could imagine another possible world where there's a different non-maximally great thing that explains the non-maximally great things in our world, and so you don't really have a circularity problem in that case. And so I do want to actually be clear. I'm more careful in my articulation. At the end of my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, I have this argument from limits, and I point out that the limited things is going to include the very property of having some limits, the general instantiation of there being something that's limited. And the idea here is that there's no possible world in which the general property of having some limits is going to be explained or caused by something that's limited in a non-circular way. So I do want to kind of point to that because I'm sure you've got some viewers who are thinking of this rigid designation. Maybe that's even what this questioner was getting at. So that's helpful to clarify that.
Yeah, so here's maybe another analogy to think about that might help. So we were working on a blog post, and we should probably pick it back up and try to finish it on the Capturing Christianity website. And I came up with an analogy about putting, like, if we could take all of the imperfect things, and I think that's the same thing that you're using, that's the same word that's describing what you're talking about, any non-maximally great things, anything that is imperfect. If we took every imperfect thing and shoved them all into a mailbox. So premise 2 is saying, can we explain the existence of the things inside the mailbox by the things inside the mailbox? Or do we have to look at something outside of the mailbox? And so that's, anyways, what yeah.
That's
Does that
helpful.
help?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. It's a good visual.
So that's what premise 2 is saying, is that the universe, things inside the mailbox, can't be explained solely by things in the mailbox, right? If you're thinking about how to explain the envelopes in your mailbox, you can't refer to the envelopes themselves as the explanation. You've got to look at something beyond the envelopes, maybe the mailman or the whoever wrote the mail to you, whatever it is, if it's a magazine or whatever else. So that's all that this is saying, is that you've got to look beyond the things themselves. So how did you define that? Maybe I'm just not following very closely, but how did you define it in the thing?
Well,
repeat it.
Yeah. There was just that the notion of explanation at work here is external explanation, and so by that definition of explanation, we're precluding circular or internal explanations. And actually, this helps even clarify what I said earlier about there's another form of this argument that allows circular explanations. Well, right, because on my definition of explanation as external, I'm saying nothing about the possibility of internal explanations. That's completely left open. All that second premise is saying is that you can't have an external explanation of, like you said, all the elements of the mailbox solely in terms of those same elements in the mailbox. And then the first premise is in terms of external explanations being possible. And so I think I like that. And the only thing I want to add here is that it doesn't matter like how many envelopes you have in that mailbox. It doesn't even matter how big the mailbox is. I mean, if somehow the mailbox could be infinite, and I know there are debates about whether there could be an actual infinite, but if there could be an actually infinite mailbox with infinitely many mailboxes or pieces of mail, maybe it just goes all the way out to forever. That entire thing, that whole mail structure, is not going to be externally explained by things totally within or internally within it. So that's the idea.
Okay, so we have another super chat here he's been sending in a bunch, and I need to get his name right. I'm gonna go slowly on this. CG Fredo. That's probably terrible pronunciation. Okay, well, thank you for your super chat either way. He says, would metaphysical necessities be an explanation for the universe and be called non-maximal? In other words, there is an alternate explanation in the actual world.
Okay, I want to ponder this to make sure I'm understanding it. My first read is that maybe the explanation can be in terms of necessity. So let me just read this again. Would metaphysical necessities be an explanation for the universe and be non-maximal? And then is there an alternative explanation? Is there an alternative explanation in the actual world? I want to focus on that first question because this is an important question. It comes up a lot. I talk about it in various of my works. One thing I want to say kind of right off the bat is that this is helpful to clarify. I think that there can be a sense in which something can have multiple explanations. So for example, let's say that I'm thirsty and I get a drink of water and I go and I grab a cup and my wife's like, Josh, why are you grabbing that cup? I guess maybe because I grabbed the wrong one. I don't know why she's asking that. But I say, oh, because I'm thirsty. Okay, there's a sense in which that explanation will remove her curiosity, I guess. I mean, as long as I wasn't doing something wrong or something. And so that helps. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other levels of explanation. So it could also be that there is a microphysical level of explanation at work. Maybe there are other descriptions that could be used to explain that. And the reason why I'm drawing this out here is because I think that even if there's some sense in which the necessity of something could provide some explanation of it, it doesn't thereby follow that this thing doesn't or couldn't admit of any other explanations. I mean, remember, we're looking at logical possible explanations. And so a nice example I like to think about sometimes is numbers, okay? So you might wonder, if you think numbers exist, if you think they're real, why all those numbers are real. Like why isn't it that like 1, 2, 3, 4 are real? 5 is not real. There's no 5. And then there's like 6, 7, or 8, 6, 7, 8 all the way up. But 5 is just not real. Like that would be really weird if it was just like this gap in the number line. It's like, okay, all the numbers, either they're all real or none of them are real. Because it would sort of be arbitrary to have just some gap in the number line. Well, one way you can think about this is that the reality of numbers themselves are explained by more fundamental principles in mathematics. And maybe, I've even wondered if maybe the most fundamental principles in mathematics are themselves explained by their contribution to a perfect supreme nature. And at least this is a sort of conceivable explanation in my mind. I don't see any truth of reason that rules it out. And so by the track record of possible explanations, my default assumption is going to be that there is an explanation unless I have some reason to think that there couldn't be. And so that's what I want to say here, which is that the universe is itself constituted of non-maximal things, and that even if that were somehow necessary, I would think that it's necessary that there be that reality because of some deeper explanation. Maybe it's sort of necessary that God make a universe. That's going to be more plausible in my mind than just cutting the explanation sequence short. Again, unless I have some independent reason to cut the explanation sequence short, I'm going to explain things as far as I can. That's the idea.
All right, we have another question. Yeah, we have another question, and this one was not sent in as a super chat, but I was reading it, and it looks super interesting. So he says, consider a proposition. The only thing that exists is the truth of this very proposition. Why can't such a statement be true, and hence God not be necessary?
So here I think what's going on is that sometimes something can be impossible, and you don't really just see its impossibility straight away. For example, let me make sure I'm really getting clear in my mind. The only thing that exists is the truth of this very proposition. So there's so many things I could say here. So one thing is you might think that this
I think what he's trying to he or she is trying to say is that it's possible. Why can't such a statement possibly be true, and hence God not be necessary?
Yeah, so it might be impossible for it to be true because that very statement entails another statement, namely that statement is true. So I mean, that would be a simple answer. There's so many things I could say. I mean, I've recently come to think that propositions can't exist. They're not even logically possible without a mind that would have to exist. But I think probably the easiest answer is to say I think propositions entail other propositions. Every proposition logically entails others, so that if one exists, you get all the others for free. So, and then another thing that I want to say is because, well, this is the first thing I wanted to say, and this is maybe a more general lesson, and I want to kind of give people freedom through this lesson, which is that there's a difference between sort of seeing that something's possible and failing to see that it's impossible. Okay, so it might be that what's going on is that you don't see how it could be impossible because you don't see a sequence of entailments that would preclude it. Now, I pointed to one possible sequence of entailments, namely that proposition entails other propositions, which entails that they exist. So that would be one possibility. But until you see that proposition might sort of look possible in just the sense that you're not seeing how it's impossible. Okay, but that's not the same as it actually being consistent with all the principles of reason. And so I think this point here does highlight that the premise that there possibly is an explanation it's actually a pretty substantial premise, and that's why I gave independent motivations for that premise. It's not one that I just say that you just see it. It's one that I think should be independently motivated, if that helps.
All right, we have another super chat from Brandon. He says, clarification question. If non-maximally great things are contingent, then premise 2 is saying contingency can't be the explanation for contingency?
Well, let's see. So it would follow that if all non-maximally great things are contingent, then premise 2 would imply that contingency can't explain contingency. Yeah, I think short answer, yes. I think that's right. Yes.
I think I actually disagree with you, Josh.
Okay, if I made a mistake, Wouldn't be the
Yes,
first
you
time.
have, I
Help
think.
me.
No. He says if non-maximally great things are contingent, they are
Yes.
contingent. But I think, and maybe you're right. But to me, we mentioned this earlier. So a necessary thing could still have an explanation.
Yes,
And
that's right.
so, yeah. So to
If
me,
non-maximally great things are contingent, then I think that premise 2 is just implying that contingency can't be explained by
can't be
contingency.
the
But
explanation for.
I think what you're seeing, Cameron, which is right, is that, which you're right, and I was still right, actually.
Yeah.
But which is, I
I
think
was
you're seeing
thinking
what
they
I'm
were in
saying.
conflict and they aren't. Oh,
Yeah.
there you go. I thought it was
So,
impossible, but
yeah. So I think tell me if this is what you're saying, is that even if there's something that's non-maximally great and necessary, that doesn't preclude that it has a further explanation in terms of
yeah,
something that's maximally great. Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
You guys see how that worked? We had a disagreement and we resolved it through reason and
Quickly.
respect and humility. I wasn't very humble though.
Okay, here's another question from 20 Faces. He says, "Does this argument not rest on the idea that existence belongs to the concept of God?" I'm going to put up the argument back up on the screen for everyone. So one more time, I'll just read it out loud for everyone. Does this argument not rest on the idea that existence belongs to the concept of God?
So I want to practice giving short answers. So no. I don't think it requires that existence belong to the concept of God. I think that it will work if we say that necessary existence belongs to the concept of God, or is a deduction from the concept of a perfect being. Or we don't even need necessary existence. We could go with necessary perfection, or perfection in all possible worlds, which I think will entail necessary existence. But these things don't have to be built into the concept of God. Technically, if I could just kind of spell this out, like the way that I actually think about it is, I think there's a kind of more basic concept of supreme greatness or perfection, which is conceptually basic in my own mind. Doesn't mean it has to be basic in every mind. And it's from this concept that I think that I can sort of see these non-trivial entailments, or these links from perfection to necessary existence, supreme knowledge, supreme goodness, perfect value, all that stuff. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But for the sake of modesty, this argument, I can sort of open it up and say, well, let's just define God as something that would be perfect in every possible world.
So this is a great question from Tommy S. And he's been actually commenting on almost every single video. I think he's an agnostic or an atheist. And so I just wanted to say to him, I've been seeing you, buddy. I've been seeing you, Tommy. So keep watching the videos, keep digging into it, and keep up with it. So here's his question. He says, could the universe be explained by something other than God? Could it be that there is an eternal and maximally great cosmos?
Okay, I really, really love this question. Really love it a lot, because it draws out this sort of association of the meaning of the term God. What I actually want to say immediately is that all my argument would establish, if it's sound, of course I think it's sound, but I leave it to you to decide. All it would establish is that there's a maximally great something. Okay, now we can think more about what could be maximally great. Could a cosmos be maximally great? What do you mean by cosmos? But as far as the argument goes, it will allow that there is a eternal, maximally great cosmos.
You do say, the argument does say, it does specify God, but I think what you're saying is that in place of God, you could just say maximally great being instead of God, and then you could just pontificate about what types of properties or what attributes that thing would have.
Yes. Yeah. And the structure of the argument, because you can actually make many different arguments with the same structure, which is explaining or possibly explaining a certain category of things to deduce some other kind of thing as an ultimate explanation. And so this could be a maximal thing. It could be a necessary thing. It could be an unlimited thing. My own view, of course, is that from supreme existence, you can actually deduce other classical attributes, such as supreme power, which includes, I think, conceptually, the power of cognition. So this is one of the reasons I think the foundation of reality would be personal, would actually have a power of cognition. This sort of falls out of the concept there. But that actually, would require sort of maybe a next stage of this argument. As far as the argument I've given here, everything is consistent. That word cosmos is sort of a flexible term, because if you start to sort of fill in that, okay, the cosmos is maximally great, then you almost, I want to be careful with change the meaning. For some people, you've changed the meaning of the word cosmos so that it now is greater than what we imagined it to be. It's not just dust or like particles all added up, or even fields. It's something more than that. It's maximally great. It has value. But maybe for other people, they have a notion of cosmos that's so flexible that it actually would be consistent with everything that I want to say when I talk about God. And so this is why I think terms are really important. And I've been finding out, Cameron, that people do just use terms differently, and you don't even know that they're using terms differently without sort of a further conversation, not just one conversation. And so I do want to just acknowledge that the argument really does leave that open at this point.
Yeah, that kind of came out in your... I was making sure that we're still on the same question here. Yeah, so that kind of came out in your discussion with Felipe Leon, right?
Yes.
How you were saying that, it just depends on how you're defining these things. And it almost... Didn't you guys come very close, at least to agree on some things?
We did. There was substantial overlap, and it was so interesting because it seemed from my perspective that he was pointing to the elements in God, rules of supreme principles of reason, moral principles, even a kind of consciousness or proto-consciousness, the fabric of the foundation. And so it's like we don't have to call those elements of God's mind. But I mean, I would just think that that's how I would use the term God. Like, these are parts of the supreme foundation. I mean, there were still points of disagreement about like how valuable this being is. Is it supreme in value, or does it have an arbitrary limit? So we got into the problem of evil. But your point here is a good one about the meaning of terms. And sometimes this will be my final point on this, is sometimes there's more overlap than you might realize. It's sort of hidden overlap because of the way that we use terms a little bit differently. And I love to discover that overlap and expose that.
So here's a question from Paul Agia, and he's a pretty popular atheist YouTuber. What's up, Paul? He says, does premise 2 say that there can be no non-maximally great brute facts? If so, how does that follow?
Facts.
And I'm going to throw the syllogism back up on the screen. So the question again, one more time, does premise 2 say that there can be no maximally great brute facts? If so, how does that follow?
I don't think, it's not saying that. So the question is whether it's entailing that somehow. There could be no maximally great brute facts. I don't see that. If he wants to follow up and elaborate how he might be seeing that, but I don't see that follows from that. I'm sorry not to give a better answer. I'm really just not seeing that. And I'm not quite sure.
I put his comment on the top of this so that we could maybe read it one more time. And Paul, if you want to elaborate and post another comment, I'll put it back up on the screen here if you want to clarify. He says, does premise 2 say that there can be no non-maximally great brute facts?
Okay. He might be getting at, this is a good question. Well, it's a good question because it's helping me to think about this. So he might be getting at whether the cause of the non-maximally great things would itself be brute.
Some people have said in the comments and answered him, and he's saying that they've answered his question. Okay. So let me actually see if I can pull it up on the screen here.
Good job, you guys.
So from Maverick Christian, he says premise 2 is compatible with the universe being a brute fact.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yes, and that's a really important point to highlight, that it does not rule out brute facts. I think I'm grasping this better here, is that's one of the strengths of the argument. Is in fact the whole reason for the argument is we're allowing the possibility, in fact even the actuality, of brute facts, of brute contingent facts, brute non-maximal facts. All that's allowed. And so the idea here is that the conclusion of the argument will be that there's a maximally great thing, but it still leaves open whether this maximally great thing is actually the cause of our universe. That's actually left open. I do have a kind of Sherlock Holmes principle that can perhaps help here, which is that if you actually have something that could explain it, it actually exists, and there's no other possible explanation, then that's a good reason to think that it is the explanation. But as far as the argument goes, it does leave that open. So it gets you, so it kind of actually allows sort of like a Big Bang that's just completely uncaused, completely brute. But hey, there's still a maximally great being that exists.
All right, I think that's going to do it for today. Is there anything that you'd like to say as a kind of summary of the argument and where you think it might lead, or do you plan on writing any papers or maybe even a book on this argument, or what are the next steps for you on this?
I've written a lot of things sort of around this argument. I might keep toying with different versions of it. But I think the main thing is I just want to thank you, Cameron, and just thank your audience for kind of thinking deeply about these things and doing it in a way that leads to progress from all perspectives, like whatever perspective you come from. Because I know these are hard questions, and sometimes I will sort of think about my thinking. I'll think about how I'm thinking so much about these very abstract things sort of at the edges of the universe. And ultimately, these things can tie back to things that are most significant to us. And I think it's because they tie back to the things that we actually care about that there are these very lively debates. And those debates are important to be had. And so I just really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this with you, Cameron. So that's my main conclusion.
Well, cool. Yeah, I'm happy to have you on. And I was thinking, because we're about to hit 50,000 subscribers, and we just did a video not too long ago celebrating 10,000 subscribers. So I was thinking it might be fun to have you back on for 50,000 just to, I don't know. We'll see what we can do. We're still thinking about what we want to do with celebrating this huge milestone. So in any case, thank you again for coming back on. We'll do another show, I'm sure, very soon on another topic, or maybe even the same topic, just covering objections. Who knows? But anyways, thanks for coming back on.
Thank you. Sounds good.
All right, so let me talk to the audience real quick. If you're watching this content, this video, and you've enjoyed it, you want to support this ministry, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. That is the best way to support this ministry. Make sure that everything is continuing to happen as it's happening. All the videos coming out, interviews, discussions. I'm hosting a discussion this weekend between Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy and Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic. They're talking about the problem of evil. And this one is actually one of our first formal debates. So they've got their openings scheduled out, and they're going to do rebuttals and closings and everything. So it's going to be a formal debate on the channel, and we're going to do some Q&A, some back and forth and everything. So it'll be an amazing, amazing dialogue. So if you want to see these types of things continue to happen, support this ministry on patreon.com/capturingchristianity. The link to that is in the description of the video. Another thing to note is that we're starting to do conferences. Our first conference is going to be in the fall of 2021. CCV1, and the guest list, the speaker list, is already starting to take shape. We've got, in fact, I was just talking with Josh Rasmussen. We're going to have him there. So we're having a whole bunch of different speakers, and I'm not announcing it yet who we've got, but we've got some pretty big names, and it's going to be an amazing conference. And the only way that this is possible, doing conferences and a few other things that we have going on, is that we're looking right now to hire my wife, Brittany, full-time in this ministry to do event planning and to do some other really, really needed things for the ministry. She's going to be connecting with supporters and donors to make sure that we're in contact with them. And she's amazing on so many different levels. But anyways, the point is that in order to do conferences, we've got to bring her on board full-time. I mean, this is a full-time job. You have no idea how much work it takes to plan something like this. And it's not just this one conference we want to do. We want to do multiple conferences every year, some conferences for just patrons, people who are signed up on Patreon. So we have a ton of different things in the works. And if you want to help this project and make sure that this happens quickly, which we're wanting to do this as soon as possible, then patreon.com/capturingchristianity is the way to do it. So anyways, thank you guys for paying attention, watching this video. And until next time, we'll see you later. And don't forget, Christianity is true.